Devoy was a fanatic. I mean, his whole cause was Irish freedom. I mean, he genuinely loved Ireland.
He's renowned for that. He's absolutely nothing to do with anything except Ireland. From the time he wakes up in the morning till the time he goes to sleep.
British intelligence had referred to John Devoy as the most dangerous enemy of Great Britain. He was the most dangerous man in America, according to Edward George Jenkinson, who was the head of the Secret Service in the 1880s.
Certainly Clan na Gael, I don't think would ever have existed or lasted in America. And I don't know where Irish history would have went either had John Devoy not lived through that time in America. Because you have to remember that all the money and finance for the IRB here came from Clan na Gael in America. So I don't know what would have happened in Irish history had John Devoy not existed.
John Devoy was born near Green Hills in Kill in September 1842. His father was from, the family would have been originally from County Laois, but he married into the Duns of Green Hills Kill, and they gave him a half-acre holding on their site. They would have been involved in the 1798 rebellion.
Well, from Devoy's own book, his Recollections of an Irish Rebel, it's quite clear that his family were involved in, let's call it, Irish nationalism, going back through the generations. His grandfather and granduncles involved in the 1798 rebellion.
John Devoy had been brought up on his family's revolutionary antecedents. He'd been brought up in stories of 1798 and stories of 1848. At a young age, when he was a child in school, he received a beating. He received a beating that nearly killed him on the basis that he refused to stand for the British national anthem, God Save the King.
Yeah, I think a lot of it's in your genes when you think of it, and he would have had this blood that's flown, this rebellious blood flowing through him, and continues into his own life, and it's there for the whole of his life. So he would have had that background as well, and the fact that they were living in the shadow of Palmerstown estate, Lord Mayo's huge estate, and his father would have worked, he would have eked out a meagre enough living, and then you had to be at the behest of men like Lord Mayo, who owned practically everything in the area.
His father involved in the repeal movement, the anti-tithe movement. His father was actually the repeal warden for the area, and his responsibility, or one of his duties, was to collect, there was a subscription, I think, of £1 a year, and he had to keep an account of that, and he had to send it off to headquarters in Dublin. And at the time, Devoy's father was living on a very small holding in Kill, which couldn't really support a growing family, so he was getting involved in, he was trying to get any extra work he could, sort of contracting work. And at the time he had made a bid for drainage work on the Mayo estate. The Earl of Mayo was the local landlord here. So he had prepared his bid for this, and it was also time to prepare his monthly report on the repeal collections. But unfortunately he put the wrong letters into the wrong envelopes. So the contract for the bid made its way to repeal headquarters in Dublin, but also his repeal report ended up on the desk of the Earl of Mayo up in Palmerstown, who wasn't at all amused, and apparently the Earl's wife took particular umbrage at it and saw it as some sort of an insult. But in any event, Devoy's father ended up losing his holding up in Kill, so it had very severe consequences for him.
After losing their family home in Kildare, the Devoy family moved to Dublin, where they lived in different parts of the city, most notably in Summerhill and in the Liberties. It was here that the young Devoy first made contact with the Irish Republican Brotherhood.
When John Devoy joined the Irish Republican Brotherhood is really the most important revolutionary movement within Ireland. The IRB is a secret, oath-bound revolutionary conspiracy that had been established in 1858, and the ambition of the IRB was to lead a revolution within Ireland. The IRB argued that the only way to achieve Irish independence was to overthrow British rule. Now, one of the first things that John Devoy does when he joins the IRB is to join the French Foreign Legion. He joins the French Foreign Legion on the basis that he wants to see service, he wants to see training in preparation for the forthcoming rebellion, and he believes that one of the best armies that he could join was the Foreign Legion.
He deserts, comes back to Ireland, then he gets involved with the Irish Republican Brotherhood, or commonly known as the Fenians, and he becomes their chief organiser and probably the most capable organiser.
He was appointed by James Stephens, the Fenian leader, to the Naas area as a recruiter for the Fenian movement in Naas.
At that stage, the Fenians enlist about 80,000 men into the Fenian Brotherhood, many of them in the British Army.
Devoy's role was essentially to meet Irishmen within the British Army and to turn them toward the Fenian cause. The idea was, as Devoy said himself, to appeal to their natural sense of patriotism. The whole plan was that when the inevitable rebellion would take place, the British Army soldiers, who were known as soldier Fenians, they would desert. They would leave the British Army and they would turn to the Fenian side, bringing their weapons and bringing their experience with them.
I think there was 26,000 British troops in Ireland at the time, and I think something like 60% of them were actually Irishmen. So he had a large field to recruit from.
There was the constant danger of, you know, if you approached somebody you thought they might have been willing to sign up and they weren't, well then obviously they went straight off and they told their commanding officer.
Of those who Devoy recruited, however, an awful lot of them were committed to an idea of an independent republic. And as a result of John Devoy's labours and John Devoy's activities, you can safely say there are thousands of Irishmen who are in the British Army who are converted to the Fenian ambition.
Like so many Fenians and Republicans before him, Devoy ran afoul of the authorities in Ireland. Those authorities included not just the police, but the church as well. Given the nature of his political activities, this was something that was bound to happen.
Yeah, the lead up to his arrest seems to have been, or at least partly attributed to a letter which he wrote in response to a sermon by the parish priest in Naas, Father Hughes.
Devoy was attending Mass one day, and Father Hughes condemned the Fenians from the pulpit, and obviously he had Devoy in mind when he was shouting down from the pulpit, but no, he wasn't. Devoy wouldn't have been flavour of the month with Father Hughes, that's for sure.
And Devoy then wrote a letter under a pseudonym, having a go at Father Hughes, and you know, more or less saying, well, you know, people who talk like this really are enemies of Ireland, you know, which was quite strong at the time. So he kind of seems to have been a marked man, really, from that point on.
How Devoy went on the run actually was, the establishment had a paper called the Hue and Cry at the time, right? And they had read at the People newspaper office, right? And they found an article Devoy had written. He had subscribed some articles to the People newspaper, and they found one of Devoy's articles, and that's how his name appeared in the Hue and Cry. So a warrant was issued for his arrest, and that would force him leaving the Naas area and hiding out in different houses in Dublin.
John Devoy is arrested in 1866 at Pillsworth's pub in James's Street in Dublin. When he's arrested in the company of a number of British Army soldiers, and he's taken immediately to prison. With Devoy's arrest, you lose one of the most important activists within the Fenian movement.
He pleads guilty because he's expecting to be rescued, and he gets 15 years, but no rescue comes, and he spends 5 years in hellholes of British prisons like Chatham Prison in Portland, where the prisoners are not allowed to speak to one another. It's silence throughout the whole day, solitary confinement.
But after 5 years, there was an amnesty committee set up to try and free the men. And by 1871, having served 5 years, they were given, himself and other Fenians were given an amnesty, right? Part of the conditions of the amnesty was that they would have to leave Ireland, spend the rest of their remaining sentence outside of Ireland, right? So New York, Devoy chose New York as his destination.
In 1871, John Devoy is released from prison with Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa, Henry Malida, John McClure and Charles Underwood O'Connell. These men now become known as the Cuba Five because they board a transatlantic steamer called the Cuba. Now, the conditions of their release are quite problematic for the Fenians and for the Cuba Five themselves. The conditions of the release were that for the duration of your sentence, you can never come home. For the duration of your sentence, you must choose a life in exile. The Cuba Five choose America. They believe that in America you have the free air of the American Republic. You have a situation where the British government can't touch you in America. You can remain active within Fenian politics. Now, when they arrive in America in 1871, there's a circus. The Americans want to be associated with the Cuba Five. You have Tammany Hall, who are rushing to see the Cuba Five. You have the Democratic Party, who are associated with Tammany Hall, who want to see the Cuba Five. The US Republican Party really want to be associated with them. You have Irish American organisations.
Oh, the reception was tremendous. They were met by the controller of the port of New York, and various boatloads of dignitaries came out to meet them. In fact, there was rather a race between the Democrats and the Republicans to see who would get to them first. And in the end, there was a certain amount of scuffling on the deck of the boat, and the Fenian ex-prisoners withdrew themselves and decided this wasn't what they'd come over for, and they went over and spent the night in New Jersey and made their own way into New York quietly the following day.
In New York, Devoy worked at a number of different jobs, but most notably as a journalist. He set up the Gaelic American newspaper that was to be the voice of Fenianism in the United States. He also joined Clan na Gael, the IRB-linked organisation in the US, though it was in disarray when he joined.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the time the Clan was kind of just one other of a vast number of Irish American organisations. You see, I suppose they had probably just grown up on an ad hoc basis. You know, you would have one individual and he was involved, you know, in a particular area, but there was no linkage between them. You know, there was no overall movement. And I think that's what Devoy's aim was from the moment almost that he landed in America.
Well, it would have been a couple of Irish American organisations at the time, but they were all splintered and they weren't working together and that. But Devoy moulds them into the one, basically into Clan na Gael, which is the family of Ireland, and he nurtures this organisation to be the strongest and the most cohesive organisation in America.
You know, I think he could see the potential power, you know, of an Irish American organisation just on the basis of sheer numbers, and you know, if you could harness that, and that's what he set out to do, and you know, he did it. Again, you know, his characteristic all through seems to have been he was focused, he was organised, he was a great organiser. You know, he had shown that in his involvement in the Fenian movement earlier on, and I think he applied that when he went to America. You know, he was good at building up these networks. That's what he set out to do with Clan na Gael, and he succeeded. You know, it became the one big overall organisation.
Now, Clan na Gael's plan was to fund the movement at home, was to fund the Irish Republican Brotherhood. But in the 1870s, in the aftermath of the Fenian Rebellion in 1867, there's an increasing recognition within Clan na Gael that the Americans need to use their position to advance the cause of Ireland. They need to be a little bit more proactive in terms of advancing the cause of Ireland. And John Devoy is one of the key figures in making this argument about how they need to be proactive.
His sole focus, and again, it's probably, you know, because he was such a single-minded individual, I think he was clear from the start when he went to America, you know, that his focus was going to be on achieving Irish independence, you know, through using Irish America and the resources that were there. I think he was, what he says in the book, in his own book, he was kind of disgusted by the disunity, you know, as illustrated by when the Cuba arrived. So I think he, you know, his aim was to pull all the Irish American organisations together and use that then, you know, to achieve Irish independence.
After uniting Clan na Gael and developing it into what would be a formidable organisation, Devoy set about planning one of the greatest escapes in the long history of Irish Republican prison breaks, the Catalpa Rescue.
In 1876, John Devoy masterminds the Catalpa escape from Fremantle in Western Australia. In the late 19th century, Fremantle in Western Australia was inescapable. It was a prison complex that you didn't even need to imprison prisoners in because there was nowhere to escape from. There was nowhere to go. It was essentially Australia's Alcatraz.
The Catalpa, well, how the Catalpa came about really was after the amnesty, when Devoy and the other Fenians were granted an amnesty. The soldiers, the Fenian soldiers who were sentenced, were not given an amnesty, and that's why they were sent to Fremantle prison in Australia. They were not given an amnesty. So Devoy received the well-known letter from the tomb from James Wilson, asking him was there any chance they would try and send him money or help him to escape.
If you think of the language that is used in the letter by James Wilson, a voice from the grave, the whole idea is that these men are dead. These men are forgotten about. Devoy is responsible for putting these men into jail. It's Devoy's actions that recruits these men into a conspiracy that results in them being uprooted, being sent to one of the worst hellholes within the Western world.
You know, that it kind of touched his conscience. And I suppose maybe because, you know, he'd been stuck in English jails for a good few years, he was conscious of this thing. You know, am I forgotten about? You know, does anyone sort of remember I'm here? And I think that might have struck a chord with him, you know. Here were people he knew on the other side of the world, you know, locked away and wondering if anyone remembered them. So I think, again, he set out to demonstrate, you know, yes, you know, we do know about you, we do remember you, we'll do whatever it takes.
John Devoy and Clan na Gael bought a whaling ship to disguise their voyage across the Atlantic. The plan was to pretend they were whalers, innocently going about their business. They set sail from New Bedford on a round trip that would take over a year to complete. They sailed to Western Australia and picked up the prisoners who had already made their way out of the prison. Almost caught by the British Navy, they ran up an American flag and escaped into international waters.
Yeah, the rescue of the men from Australia and the Catalpa rescue, it's a huge undertaking, like to send a whaling ship from Boston over to Australia, and it takes well over a year. Like it set out in April '75 and returned in August '76. So this is a huge undertaking, and again, it's financed, it's organised by Devoy.
Again, the amount of organising involved was incredible. You know, you were operating on the other side of the world. A huge amount of planning had to go into it over a long period of time. You know, you had to charter boats, you had to plan, you had to put people in place. So, you know, it was a major achievement. And again, I think it's just illustrative of Devoy's organising ability and his single-minded pursuit.
Devoy had masterminded this conspiracy that had to go all across Clan na Gael. It was all across the eastern board of America. People in New York knew about it, people in New Jersey knew about it, people in Chicago knew about it. A lot of people knew about it within the Fenian movement, but bizarrely no one talked. The British had no idea that this escape was going to take place.
He put the motion to a convention, a Fenian convention. The motion was passed, they raised the money, bought the Catalpa ship, sailed it to Fremantle, got 6 of them out and back to America.
It went smooth enough now. It was nearly, like any good story, it was nearly a bad run at the end there when the British Navy appeared, but they got into international waters then, and then they were safe. So, and they ran up the American flag, and that saved them. But the British government were not happy.
It was a big event worldwide. It made the news everywhere. Again, you know, they reaped. They made as much of it as they could. I suppose understandable, you know, given the history of failures of nationalism and so on. You know, when you get a success like that, you celebrate it and you play it for all it's worth. And again, Devoy was very good at that. You know, he was good at the PR campaign. He was a journalist after all. You know, he knew how to play that game very well.
During his time in New York, Devoy worked with a large number of Irish Republicans. Out of all of them, though, one would help bring Ireland closer than it ever was before to independence. That man was Tom Clark. Clark had served 15 years in British prisons. Unable to find work in Ireland, he went to the US, where he immediately made contact with Devoy.
Tom couldn't get work in Ireland. He tried, I mean, many people tried to give him work, but it never worked out. So he went back to New York, where he had been, and contacted John Devoy and started to work as essentially John's. He worked during the day, but in his spare time he worked for the Clan na Gael and worked. They founded a newspaper which Tom helped to edit and run, and he wrote letters and so on. He was Devoy's secretary for a long time. Devoy didn't think very much of him at the first time he met him, but he gradually got to know Tom well and to realise that he was someone of the same sort of material as himself, equally committed and strong and determined to fight for Ireland's freedom.
Tom Clark would have been a friend and comrade of his for so many years, and Clark is really the father of he's known as the father of Ireland. He's the one that is the instigator of the whole rebellion. He's the one that spots Pearse speaking and brings him into the fold. He's the one that organises practically everything. You know, he's IRB, he's Fenian, he's, after being in jail for so long, he'd rather be executed than sent back to jail. He had such a hard time there as well. So it's between Clark and Devoy that this connection comes through.
I think they recognised one another, you know, they got on well. Tom equally was a very hard-working person and devoted his life to, apart from his family, to the cause. And again, equally did not trust people lightly. He had to get to know you first. He was suspicious of people.
And there's a very strong friendship between himself and Devoy in the late 18th, early 20th century. Devoy sends Thomas James Clark back to Ireland because Devoy doesn't trust anyone back home. Devoy doesn't trust the Supreme Council. Devoy argues that he will not work with anyone except Clark, and he has Clark put on the Supreme Council as the treasurer of the Irish Republican Brotherhood. And having put Clark on that Supreme Council as the treasurer of that organisation, this now sets in motion a chain of events that will culminate in the forthcoming Easter Rebellion of 1916.
Whilst Devoy is probably mostly remembered for providing the funding for Roger Casement's failed attempt to smuggle weapons from Germany, what is less known is that by the time Casement was captured, Devoy had already supplied the Irish rebels with around $100,000 for arms and uniforms. Without this financing, it's unlikely the rising could have happened the way it did. But was Devoy's role really so pivotal?
His role was very, very important in the 1916 rising. If he had his own way, it would have been more important because he would have arrived in time to fight himself, and he wanted to do this. He wanted to be shot down in the street. He would have been glad to be stood up against the wall and executed with Clark or Pearse or whatever. And there was an idea that he was going to get false documents made up so he could sail over to Dublin and fight in the rising. And O'Donovan Ross is with us, says no, stay at home, his work was more important at home. But he would have gladly arrived and fought.
He realised, I think, again, based on history and so on, you know, you can't achieve very much, you know, if you don't have, if you're going to engage in a struggle, you need weapons. So he set about raising money. That's what he used the Klan for in America. And in the whole run up to 1916, you know, he was the one organising the money to allow them to buy the weapons. So yeah, that was his role, and you know, it was a key role. You know, it's often overlooked, but if you don't have weapons, you can't have a revolution.
The Easter Rising would not have happened without John Devoy. The Easter Rising couldn't have happened without John Devoy. John Devoy is a great, important figure within Irish history. Devoy is providing the money, he's providing the support, he's providing the ambition toward this rebellion. Devoy and Thomas James Clark have a relationship. This relationship that they have is the driving force behind the Easter Rising. These two individuals have come together, and these two individuals have come together to assemble more or less a team to lead forward this rebellion, to lead this revolution within Irish history. They genuinely believe that a rebellion must take place during the course of the First World War. John Devoy very strongly believes that this is Britain's difficulty. Britain's difficulty has come, and if we allow this opportunity to pass without doing something, then we will never do anything.
Hundreds of thousands of dollars poured into the Clark's home because that he was the treasurer, the IRB, and he and Kathleen looked after the money, and clearly they looked after it very well. They didn't, they weren't skimming it off the top, because they weren't living in very high circumstances themselves. But if money was needed for arms or whatever, people would just go out to Fairview and Kathleen would hand them out the money.
Well, if I would claim that they sent over $100,000 for the 1960 to finance the 1960 rise, now they had to pay for the 20,000 rifles that they bought from the Germans. There was another Kildare man, John Kenny from Kilcock, who was a good loyal friend of Devoy's, was used as a courier to bring money back and forward over to Ireland, and that to meet the likes of Tom Clark in Dublin, organise all the time and fund everything.
It couldn't have been done without the money. The money was essential and a lot of that came through John Daly as well. Devoy sent it to Daly in Limerick, and more of it came up that way as well. And funded the volunteers, it funded the training, the uniforms, the arms. Every successful revolution needs money.
Devoy has been underwritten within the history of the Easter Rising. One of his enemies within America was also a Fenian. His enemy was called Patrick Egan. Now, Patrick Egan had formerly been the treasurer to the Land League. He'd also been a member of the Irish National Invincibles, who famously assassinated Cavendish and Burke in the Phoenix Park in 1882. And Egan famously denounced John Devoy in the aftermath of the Rising in the strongest terms possible, when he announced through a newspaper in America that if anyone deserved to be shot for their role within the Easter Rising of 1916, it was John Devoy. Devoy is as much a part and a figure within that great rebellion in Irish history as the likes of Patrick Pearse.
Devoy was not shot for his role in the Easter Rising, however. He lived to see the formation of the Free State in late 1922 and visited the country in 1924. He passed away in 1928, and like O'Donovan Rossa before him, his body was repatriated to Ireland. A massive funeral was held, with thousands turning out to catch one final glimpse of the greatest of the Fenians, before his remains were interned in Glasnevin Cemetery. Although largely written out of the history of the Free State, it's no exaggeration to say that without him, independence might not have been possible.